There's a photograph the public was never supposed to see. It's a grainy image of boys chained together looking terrified. When it surfaced in the late 80s, investigators thought one of them looked a lot like a boy who vanished from Iowa years earlier. His name was Johnny Gosch. He's a 12-year-old paperboy who disappeared on a Sunday morning in 1982. No note, no body, no closure. Decades later, his mother receives a knock at her door. Standing in the dark was her son. He's alive, grown up, late 20s, shaken and terrified. What followed was a missing persons case that went deeper than anyone could ever have imagined. His mother uncovered evidence that pointed to something eerily similar to our previous episode on the Finders. They're a covert network moving children across state lines with purported intelligence connections. Her story was dismissed as hysteria, but when federal documents on the Finders cult began leaking years later, researchers noticed disturbing overlaps. 40 years later, the official story still insists Johnny was just missing, but the paper trail, the testimonies, and the late-night visit at his mother's door tell a completely different story. I'm John Genua, and you're watching America's Strangest History. Tonight's a viewer request video, and we're following the trail from the Iowa suburbs all the way to Washington, D.C. This is the story of a mother's search for her missing son that collided with the deepest corners of the American intelligence world. So, what happened to Johnny Gosch? In the early 1980s, West Des Moines, Iowa was a quiet, middle-class suburb. I'm talking tree-lined streets, unlocked doors. There's an almost palpable sense that danger lived somewhere else. Johnny Gosch grew right up in the middle of it. He was 12 years old and saving money from his paper route to someday buy a car. He loved dogs, sports, practical jokes. Neighbors remembered him as polite and always early to work. In a time before cell phones and 24-hour news cycles, a paper route demonstrated a certain level of trust. Parents trusted their community. Kids trusted the adults around them. Johnny's parents, Noreen and John Gosch, were active in their church and well-known locally. His mother often helped Johnny fold and bag the Des Moines Register before sunrise. Sunday morning, September 5th, 1982, seemed ordinary. Just after 6 a.m., Johnny left home with his wagon, his red newspaper bag, and the family dog Gretchen. Within about an hour, neighbors noticed something was off. Johnny's wagon was abandoned on the sidewalk, still full of papers, still perfectly stacked, but Johnny was gone. When Noreen called the police, the initial response was confusion. Boys Johnny's age run away all the time. He'd probably show up by dinner, but she knew better. Something was different. I mean, his money, his dog, his route were all left behind. From that moment on, she was on a mission. Noreen Gosch didn't wait for police. Within minutes, she was on the phone with neighbors, reporters, anyone who'd listen. The community rallied. People searched yards, alleys, drainage ditches. Nothing. By the end of the first day, West Des Moines didn't feel so safe anymore. The police finally opened up an investigation, but not because they wanted to. It was because Noreen refused to leave the station until they did. Witnesses came forward. One neighbor, John Rossi, said that Johnny was talking to a man in a blue two-tone Ford Fairmont asking for directions. Rossi even looked at the license plate, but later couldn't recall the full set of numbers. Under hypnosis, he reported a few digits and said it looked like a Warren County, Iowa tag. Investigators never found a car or a driver to match, and later retellings had some conflictions over the state of the plate, another reason the lead went cold. So the license plate was a dead end. The car was gone. The driver was never identified. In the days that followed, there were reported sightings of a man following other paperboys and a car circling the same neighborhoods at dawn. But by the time police took those tips seriously, the trail had already gone cold. Around the same period, Indianola in Warren County had a string of attempted abductions of paper carriers that an Iowa DCI official said bore curious similarities to Jimmy's case. Now, this is possible context for why Warren County tags stuck in the investigators' minds, even though it never really produced a match. Noreen organized her own searches. She handed out flyers with Johnny's photos across Iowa. She went on television stations. She spoke to Congress. Most importantly, she never gave up. Noreen believed this wasn't a simple kidnapping. It was part of something much bigger, and she was going to prove it. From the beginning, Noreen Gosch believed that the investigation was being mishandled. Leads were lost. Tips went unlocked. Crucial hours had already slipped away. Now, by the time police expanded their search beyond West Des Moines, any physical proof of Johnny was long gone. Within weeks, a pattern started to form. Another Des Moines paperboy, Eugene Martin, disappeared under almost identical circumstances just 2 years later. Then in 1986, Mark Allen vanished in the same area. 3 boys, same region, no suspects. For many, it began to feel less like coincidence and more like a concerted effort. As pressure mounted, investigators floated theories ranging from runaways to lone abductors. But Noreen refused to accept the local explanation. Through private investigators and her own research, she started connecting the dots that the law enforcement seemed unwilling to touch. One of the most controversial figures to emerge in the case was Paul Bonacci. He's a young man from Omaha who claimed he'd been abducted into a nationwide trafficking network as a child. Now, when he came forward in the late 80s, he told investigators he had actually been present during Johnny's abduction. Bonacci said a man he called Emilio orchestrated the kidnapping using a blue car and a team that targeted paperboys along predictable routes. Now, according to his testimony, Johnny was forced into the car, restrained, and transported across state lines to a safe house in Colorado. He described an underground room. The walls were marked with children's initials. Johnny was kept there for months. He was photographed and conditioned to comply through threats and drugs. He also recounted specific details about Johnny that were never made public, like a birthmark on his chest, a burn scar on his leg, and a stammer that only surfaced when he was frightened. Now, those details caught Noreen's attention. They matched what she knew. Bonacci said the network wasn't a random group of predators. It was organized. He claimed it involved people who moved children between cities using fake charities and shell businesses, sometimes under the cover of training programs and psychological studies that later appeared in federal documents on the finders. He described buyers who were well-connected and handlers who used coded language to mask operations that extended from Nebraska to Washington, D.C. Law enforcement never substantiated his claims. The FBI dismissed Bonacci as unreliable. They cited inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence. But Noreen Gosch wasn't buying it. To her, Bonacci's story filled in the blanks. Blanks that the official reports refused to address. Like, why were multiple paperboys vanishing? Why were witnesses being ignored? Why were certain files sealed? She reached out to former FBI agent Ted Gunderson and Nebraska Senator John DeCamp, who were already investigating the Franklin network. Their reports confirmed what she'd been hearing for years. Organized groups using coded communication, fake charities, sometimes even government fronts to conceal exploitation. Surprise, surprise, we see the same terminology that appeared later in the finders documents. Phrases like training exercises, data gathering, psychological conditioning. Now, officially, these connections were written off as conspiracy, but Noreen saw something that the public didn't or couldn't. Clear patterns repeating across cases, across decades, and across jurisdictions that never compared notes. Now, if these disappearances were connected, who had the power to keep them buried? Over the years, a handful of disturbing artifacts surfaced. I'm talking photos, documents, federal memos. Each adds another layer to the story. In 1989, a packet of photographs arrived at Noreen Gosch's doorstep. Now, one image showed 3 boys lying face down, hands bound behind them. Another showed a boy who looked a lot like Jimmy. The same hair, the same facial structure, the same mark on his chest. Investigators couldn't agree on whether it was really him. The photos were traced to an old Florida child exploitation case. Officials say that they predated Johnny's abduction, but Noreen insisted at least one of the boys in those photos was her son. That discovery pushed the case back into the public view. If the photos weren't Johnny, how did they end up in her mailbox? And if they were, what did that mean for where he'd been all these years? Then came the connection that made everything even stranger. Within a few years, the FBI's finders files began to leak. Hundreds of pages describing a secretive group investigated in the mid-80s for alleged child trafficking and intelligence ties. The language in the reports, phrases like training exercises, psychological testing, and data collection on children mirrored the terminology Bonacci used years earlier. Now, both stories mentioned transport across state lines, coded communication, and photographic documentation expressly labeled as training. To Noreen, it felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. She believed the finders files proved that the kind of organization Bonacci described really did exist. It was operating in the shadows and intersecting with federal agencies until it was quietly buried once discovered. Law enforcement officials denied any link between the two cases. The finders' investigation was closed and no charges filed. But to researchers and independent journalists, the overlap of the language and the timing was impossible to ignore. Then, in 1997, came an event that changed everything for Noreen Gosch personally. She said that one night, around 2:30 in the morning, she woke to a knock at her door. Standing in the dark was a man in his late 20s. He looked older, gaunt, disturbingly terrified. Behind him stood a second man who never spoke. She said she recognized the first man immediately. It was Johnny. He told her he escaped, but that he was still being watched. He warned if she ever tried to follow him, they'd both be killed. The visit lasted less than an hour, then he was gone. Police could never verify the encounter beyond Noreen's word. There were no photographs, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence. But to Noreen, it wasn't a question of belief. She'd seen her son, and the detail Bonacci mentioned, the birthmark on Johnny's chest, that was exactly what she said she saw that night. After that, she redoubled her effort to prove Johnny's disappearance wasn't random. Her files, interviews, and testimonies became a living archive, one that tied together the abductions in Iowa, the Franklin scandal in Nebraska, and the Finders investigation in Washington, D.C. 4 decades later, none of it has been officially confirmed or disproven. Every document raises another question. Witnesses fade with time, and through it all, Noreen Gosch remains convinced that the truth was never hidden in plain sight. It was buried on purpose. By the early 90s, the case had become a national flashpoint. Part true crime mystery, part political scandal, part cultural mirror for a country beginning to question who it could trust. In 1990, Paul Bonacci filed a civil suit against Larry King Jr., that's the Omaha banker at the center of the Franklin credit union scandal. He accused King of abuse and trafficking. Now, these allegations echoed what Bonacci told Noreen about Johnny's abduction. King was already serving time for financial crimes, but Bonacci's case forced the courts to hear testimony about the alleged network itself. Noreen Gosch was called to testify. She told the court that Bonacci's description of Johnny's birthmark, scar, and speech patterns were exact, and that his timeline lined up with sightings she logged and collected. The federal judge, Warren Urban, ultimately ruled that Bonacci's account of being victimized was credible enough for a civil judgment, even though the broader conspiracy was unproven. Now, Bonacci won around $1 million in damages against King, but no new criminal charges followed. The ruling acknowledged Bonacci's trauma, not the existence of a larger ring. Still, for Noreen, the verdict was kind of a vindication. A federal court effectively said that at least part of Bonacci's story was believable. Now, if one piece was true, how much more had been ignored? The media reaction was divided. Mainstream outlets framed the case as a cautionary tale about hysteria and rumor. Independent journalists saw it as another example of powerful institutions closing ranks. The Des Moines Register described Noreen as relentless, obsessed, and unyielding. Now, these phrases were meant as criticism, but in retrospect, they kind of sound like badges of honor, right? By the mid-90s, the Franklin investigation was closed, the Finders files were sealed, and official attention shifted elsewhere. But Noreen kept collecting documents and speaking at conferences and pressuring Congress for transparency in both missing children protocols and intelligence oversight. To this day, there's never been an official trial or public inquiry focused solely on Johnny's disappearance. The record ends where it began, with a wagon full of newspapers and a mother who refused to stop asking questions. By the late 90s, the official case file on Johnny Gosch was cold. No new physical evidence, no verified sightings, just thousands of pages of letters and interviews and private notes, all gathered by Noreen Gosch. Then in 2000, Noreen published her book, Why Johnny Can't Come Home. It's part memoir, part archive, part indictment of the system that failed her son. It reignited public interest at a time when the internet was giving new life to unsolved cases and government secrecy debates. Now, over the next decade, several new threads appeared. None proved conclusive, though. A Florida man was briefly investigated after a set of photos resembling the ones Noreen received resurfaced in an evidence review. Then, in 2016, nearly 800 pages of FBI Finders documents were released through the Freedom of Information Act. The files described a Washington-based group investigated in the mid-80s for alleged child trafficking and possible ties to intelligence agencies. The investigation was abruptly shut down. The files were sealed. When the documents became public, researchers noticed the same patterns Noreen and Bonacci described. I mentioned them earlier. References to training exercises, data collection on children, psychological studies. Coincidence? No direct link was proven, but the resemblance is pretty hard to ignore. Around the same time, independent journalists began tracing how language from the Franklin scandal and the Finders files overlapped with internal memos from the Department of Justice. Even mainstream media outlets started revisiting the case. Most notably, the documentary Who Took Johnny in 2014 brought Noreen's story to a new generation. Forensic retesting has been limited. West Des Moines police periodically review the case with modern DNA technology, but without new evidence, no samples exist to compare. In 2006, Noreen said she received 3 new photos of boys who might be Johnny, but but digital analysis was inconclusive. Despite the silence from official channels, Johnny's name changed national policy. The Johnny Gosch bill became a model for legislation requiring immediate police response when a child goes missing. It also paved the way for the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984. Every Amber Alert, every rapid response protocol traces back to a 12-year-old paperboy from Iowa who never made it home. 4 decades later, the official record still insists Johnny Gosch is simply missing. But for those who followed the trail, the photos, the testimonies, the patterns, questions linger. What if the truth was never lost? What if it was simply classified? In the years since Johnny Gosch vanished, the landscape of missing child investigations has completely changed. Johnny's name helped build the systems that protects children today. Laws now require immediate police response and cross-jurisdictional databases, as well as nationwide alerts that didn't exist when he disappeared. That's the practical legacy here. For some, this is a story about a mother who couldn't accept tragedy, and for others, it's evidence of a darker undercurrent in American power, one that touches cases like the Finders, the Franklin Network, and who knows how many other sealed investigations. Noreen Gosch once said she didn't want revenge, she just wanted to know where her son was, dead or alive. The question remains unanswered. No remains, so no DNA. There's no official suspect, just Noreen's memory and ours. I'm John Genua, and this is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.